I'm Dr. Peggy Determeyer, and I'd like to welcome you to our program on funeral planning today. Um, I have deliberately planned this so that you have time to ask questions at the end. I think I found that with the Zoom meetings, asking questions at the end tends to work better. And I'll take the PowerPoint down, and then we can see your smiling faces. Very ex- uh, glad to see everyone here today. For those of you who are familiar with the Hope and Healing Center, and I recognize some of the names, so I know that some of you are, we're a premier mental health outreach here in the Houston area, and I am a piece of that, serving the aging communities and promoting healthy aging and helping those with folks with various aging issues. I've kind of summed it down to aging, caregiving, and grief, just because those are three things that seem to affect all of us. Today's program grew out of some questions that I have been asked over the years about funeral planning. Um, Funeral planning is not something we're really good at. We don't really like to do it. And I would tell you, I would start off by telling you of my own experiences. Um, my mom died fairly young at age 66, so it was about, gosh, 29 years ago of colon cancer. And when she died, my dad had and she had done absolutely nothing about planning a funeral. They knew she was dying. They admitted to themselves that she was on her path to life's end. And in fact, she was enrolled in hospice for a few weeks before she died, but they had done nothing. And so, as a result, um, my dad and I ended up doing all the planning. Fortunately, they were living in Virginia, and they knew one of the premier funeral directors in the area. He had been in the business for a really long time. So my dad called him up, and Sid was really helpful in guiding my dad and me through the process, because at that point I had not planned any funerals. My dad kept looking to me for things that I really wasn't too sure about myself. This was long before I went to seminary, but he kept asking me about, well, what music should we have and what reading should we use in the service? Um, and we did everything on the fly. Fast forward, my dad died about a year and a half ago, and he and his second wife had planned everything down to the T, including writing their own obituaries, planning out the services, knowing which church they were going to use, knowing where their funeral plots were going to be, even picking out their caskets and other necessary things. And I'm going to go through some of those things as we go forward. And I will tell you, as the adult child of this, it was a whole lot easier. He had even prepaid. There are advantages and disadvantages to that, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go through the presentation. But having at least thought about what was going on and what decisions needed to be made life a whole lot easier for my brothers and me. So I am now, and I will admit, my husband and I have done nothing about this other than some kind of side comments, and I'll tell you when I get there why these things have come to mind. But what I'm offering today is just a primer of the things to begin to think about. And certainly there are many different resources that you can access. But I've intended this as a primer that just gives you some basic information to think about and gives you uh, an outline of what to begin to ask as you go forward. This doesn't relate, I'm not selling anything, so I don't have any financial relationships. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about the why, what, when, where, and who. It's the 5 questions that we were taught as children to ask, or at least I was in my elementary school when you're learning about something. Um, and so I've given you a little bit of the why, um, but it's inevitable. I mean, I don't think any of us are disillusioned enough to think that we are not going to die and that we're not going to need a funeral. Um, Specifically for people we love, in cases there are like funerals we end up going to or planning that we had no idea we would end up planning. For example, if someone uh, has experiences the death of a child. Um, these are just things we don't want to think about, and there's nothing wrong with that. Um, it's emotionally exhausting. I'm emotional and exhausting. I will tell you that no matter how well everything is planned out and how well it goes, it's a trying time. Grieving is hard work. Planning the the loss of someone who's near and dear to you, that's hard work. We just don't want to do that. And finally, um, planning a funeral is something that can bring out the absolute worst in people. And the conflicts come up not because sometimes they're because there are underlying conflicts in the family to begin with, but making decisions about stressful matters can cause its own elements of conflicts. And anything that you can do to avoid those conflicts is helpful. So, what are the elements for a funeral? There's 3 primary areas, and I'm going to talk a little bit about each one. The first one is the preparation for the corpse. The second one is the services or the honors that we want to accord to the person. And that can take all manners of form. And I'm going to talk a little bit about different options. And then finally, handling the interment of the body or the ashes. So, some of you know I was a hospital chaplain for quite a few years and experienced a lot of deaths in the hospital with some of which were expected and some of which weren't. So, one of the rules that happens that you should know about is if your loved one dies within 24 hours of being admitted to the hospital, there is the requirement in the state of Texas that the there be a review of whether a postmortem is needed or required. For example, if somebody is murdered, there will be an autopsy. If someone harms themselves, there will be an autopsy. If someone dies after a long and involved illness, even when they die within 24 hours of being admitted to the hospital, which happens a lot, most often there will be a doctor who will sign the death certificate to say, yes, this person was terminally ill and they were expected to die. So don't be surprised if you have someone tell you, oh, my so and so died and they had been in the hospital less than 24 hours and there was either the recommendation for an autopsy or uh, there was a review of whether an autopsy was needed. This is, if it's a matter of law, if it's foul play is suspected, then the autopsy is paid for by the state. But if you choose to do an autopsy when none is required, then most often you will be required to pay for it, and insurance may or may not pay for that. It depends on the circumstances. So these are things kind of you need to know about. The second part of preparing the body is whether to embalm or not. In the state of Texas, as I understand it, if you are going to have an open casket viewing, you are required to embalm the body. As it turns out, this was also the rule in the state of Tennessee where my dad died. We as a family made a decision. We did not want to have an open casket viewing because my dad was a shadow of his former self when he died. This was just not having him to be made up and uh, affected us as much as anything, and we did not want him to be seen in that way. And so the third thing is some people do choose to have a viewing. My mother was very adamant when she was dying. She said she did not want a viewing. And again, she died after a long illness. She was a shadow of her former self. She did not want to be seen that way. And frankly, we didn't want her to be seen that way. But in some areas of the country, this is part of the funeral experience. And when my dad's second wife died, she was adamant that she wanted an open casket viewing. So my dad honored her request. And it was kind of interesting because my dad kept trying to get the kids and grandkids to come over and look at her, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. And my dad said later, he said, well, it was strange. Nobody wanted to come look at her. And I just looked at him. I said, Daddy, that wasn't Betty. Her soul was already with God. And he looked at me. He said, yeah, I guess you're right. But again, this is something different for everybody, and everybody has a different view of that. Honoring the person. So the obituaries these days are in times past, and some very small local newspapers may still do it, but in times past, the obituary was published as a public service. That is in the newspaper. That is no longer the case. Obituaries are now essentially paid advertisements, and people have to pay either by the word or by the column inch, depending on how that particular newspaper operates. Excuse me. So, what a lot of people are doing now, there are still people who will publish the big full-blown obituary in the newspaper. If you do that, prepare to pay $1,000 or more if you're using the Houston Chronicle. It's expensive. What the funeral home suggested when my dad died, and we had the traditional obituary with where he was born and where he had lived and where he died and his children and grandchildren and all that good stuff. But what the funeral home suggested was that we just publish a short announcement of Carl Determeyer died on such and so date. Funeral services will be held at this day and time, and that was it. And then they gave the website for the funeral home. So somebody who was interested in reading more about my dad, they could just click on the link or load the link in, and they could read all about him. And that ended up being it met all the needs, because in truth, a lot of people don't even subscribe to the newspaper anymore. In fact, my dad found out he relied purely on the newspaper when my stepmother died, and he found out that most people didn't even subscribe to the newspaper, so some people hadn't even learned of her death. So it's it's all interesting. Um, whether to have religious services or some other kinds of observance. So, for those of us who have strong church affiliations, it's most often that we have a religious service with some sort of a get together afterwards. When my mother died, we had a lovely memorial service. Her body, we had done the interment uh, early that morning. And so that afternoon, when we had the religious service, it was a memorial service. So that's sometimes the language is used that a funeral service has the body there, a memorial service does not. But then you have to pick who the officiant or officiants are going to be, what readings you want, what music you want, and what kind of music you want. Do you want strictly instrumental music or vocal music or both? Who are the ushers or pallbearers going to be? What kind of a bulletin or program do you want? I've seen everything from a simple order of worship to a booklet that had lots of pictures and stories about the person. And that's all of those are options, and all of those are things that you can think about as you go forward. Um, other observances. So as a chaplain, I would sometimes be asked to lead services for people who had died when they had no church affiliation. And sometimes they wanted a religious service, and sometimes they didn't really want a religious service. It was a more secular service. One of the most interesting memorial services I did was for a lady who, with her husband, had been mural painters in their youth, and they had painted these beautiful murals all over the country. And so, for her memorial remembrance, he didn't want to have a religious service, but they got space in their favorite Mexican restaurant on a Saturday afternoon. They had, basically their own corner of the restaurant, and he brought a bunch of photographs of these different murals that they had prepared. And they had stories about those. He told stories about those murals that they had done and where they had done them and the conditions. And some of their friends who had been living near them at the time spoke. And it was really, really, really nice as a memorial to this woman whose life had been so full with her artistic endeavors and with her husband's artistic endeavors. And um, they had me say a prayer, but that was the only thing overtly religious about the entire afternoon. But it was lovely. Whether to do flowers and memorials. So nowadays, I would dare say the majority of people ask for memorials in lieu of flowers. Some people like to send flowers and end up sending flowers anyway, and that's fine. But it is nice to have a memorial to the person, either with an organization where they worked or an organization that they supported themselves. Um, in my dad's case, he had memorials given to their church because that was a place that had been very important to him and his wife. It was where they had been married, both as widowed individuals, and they had been involved with the life of the church, and so it made a lot of sense. Handling the interment. So there are two kinds of burial. One is in a mausoleum, and those are the kind of edifices that you see. Sometimes they have them, like in New Orleans. There are a lot of mausoleums because of the high water table. The other is burying in the ground. For ashes, there are columbariums. St. Martin's has their own columbarium here on the grounds. A lot of churches have started columbariums because with a greater number of people opting for cremation rather than burial, um, they have found that it's nice to have a sacred space where the ashes are interred. Uh, there are other people who have opted for scattering ashes, or for burial at sea, or and then when you have a burial, what kind of grave markers do you want? Some cemeteries have a requirement for flat, basically headstones. Other cemeteries have the more elaborate monuments with the names carved into the granite. You can see those all over the place, and they're a variety. So I'm going to talk a little bit about unique situations. Um, veterans. Veterans have their own um, benefits as a result of having been in the services of the United States military. So when I was a chaplain on a Friday afternoon, a person died suddenly on one of our floors. He was elderly. He had lots of things wrong with him. He had not planned, nobody had planned for him to die that afternoon. And his widow and one of his children were there, and they were just befluxed because they didn't know what to do next. And so I said to the gentleman's wife, I said, well, I don't want to be forward. I was a fairly new chaplain at that time. I said, I don't want to be forward, but have you thought about funeral plans? And she looked up and she said, well, he was in the military and he always told me he wanted to be buried through the VA. And I said, okay, well, let me see what I can find out about that, because that's all he had told her. He hadn't told her what to do. And so, as a brand new shiny chaplain, I picked up and I looked online, got the telephone number for the Veterans Administration, and I called. And the first miracle was that the somebody at 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon answered the telephone. The second miracle was the person knew what they were talking about and was helpful. So it turns out if you are a veteran, all you need to do is to tell whatever funeral home you choose to work with that your loved one was a veteran, and they will take care of everything else. They will coordinate what will happen. They will coordinate if you want to have an honor guard at the funeral service, because that's one of the benefits of being a veteran. I did a graveside service for a gentleman, and he had been a veteran, and they had the flag ceremony where they fold up the flag and give it to the widow. And it's, to me, those are always very touching. But it was really nice to have them do that. But all you have to do is tell the funeral home, my loved one was a veteran, and they will take care of the rest. Pre-planning versus prepaying. So what I'm advocating for here today is to do some planning, to think about what do you want, who do you want to do things, how do you want them done, do you want to be buried, do you want to be cremated, do you want what is it that's important to you? Prepaying, there are basically insurance plans that you can pay. There are either insurance plans, or you can go through some funeral homes. For example, Service Corporation International is one of the largest publicly held funeral establishments in the US, and they will sell you a financial plan that basically involves prepaying. There are pros and cons to that. As I mentioned earlier, my dad and his second wife prepaid for everything down to the penny, but they were living in the same place. They knew for sure that that was the funeral home they were going to use, and they knew where the cemetery was going to be. If you're younger and expect to move around some, or even if you're older and expect to move around some, I would strongly encourage you not to do prepaying because the shifting around a fund sometimes gets challenging. Now, if you're working strictly with a national company, then it's a different sort of thing. But this is something that every one of us has to think about. What's important to us, and how do we think about doing this? Um, Again, pre-planning is really important. Prepaying, not so much, although it is a good idea to have an idea of the budget that you want to have, because there have been some pretty unpleasant stories about unscrupulous funeral homes where they try to guilt the people into spending a lot more than they want to. Which brings me to my next topic of comparison shopping. Um, I will tell you that costs vary greatly. You would think that a funeral is a funeral is a funeral, and it's not. Um, I I will note that when I was a chaplain and I would talk to people about these things, I had one family tell me that two funeral homes in the same city along the same stretch of interstate were vastly different in the charges that they estimated for fundamentally the same service. So it does pay to do a little comparison shopping. And to that degree, in your pre planning, think about what is your budget and how much do you want to spend. A full blown funeral with a casket and a graveside can, excluding the grave site itself and opening and closing for that, could be between $8,000 and $15,000. There are even a cremation, which you would think would be fairly straightforward, varies from the no frills cremation services, which cost less than $1,000, to going through a funeral home where it'll cost $3,000 or $4,000. And I know this because I've done this for friends of calling and doing the comparison shopping. So if your choice is you've already got a place to have a service and you know you want to be cremated, just go through the direct cremation services. You'll pay a lot less. They'll give you the cremains in a box, and then you can either get a nicer box for the interment or you can get an urn or whatever it is you want to do. They even make jewelry now with that you can put some of the ashes in the jewelry as a remembrance. Um, Another option is donating your body to science. At the end of this presentation, I give you a couple of places. There are two places in Houston. I know not everybody on this call today is from Houston, but both the University of Texas and the Baylor College of Medicine and the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston accept donated bodies for science. As it turns out, my mother-in-law, who lived to 108 and lived in Michigan, had donated her body to science. And what happens is most often they are used unless the body is dedicated to a specific research project. The body will be used by medical students to learn anatomy, to learn basic anatomy. Some people find that offensive. It's a real gift of service to medical students, because that's how they learn how the body is made up in real time. But my when as my mother-in-law was getting older and older, she said to my brother-in-law, said to me one day, "Well, I don't even know if they'll still want my body." And I said, "Oh, yes, they will," because she had lived to 108 in pretty good shape. So that is an option. It's a very selfless option. What they do once you donate the body, then they will cremate the remains, what is left over after the students are finished, and give you those cremains to dispose of or inter as you will. And some of I know at UTMB and in the medical center, they even have annual services honoring those who have donated their bodies, which I think is really nice. Um, I've documenting your wishes and plans. This goes along with what I've been saying about pre-planning. Write down what you want. Um, Write down what's important to you. If you have a favorite song, if you have a favorite reading from scriptures. I know in the Episcopal Church and in the Methodist Church, where they have formalized liturgies to go with funeral services or memorial services, they'll give you a list of hymns to use or a list of readings to use. But some of us have favorite readings that may not even be scripture. You may have a poem or a piece of prose that has been important to you. But put that in writing, because then the people who are left behind, and don't be afraid to talk about it with the people you love. Honorariums become a tough topic sometimes. I have had people ask me, and I've looked it up. And if you look it up, you get everything from $30 to several $100s. Part of that depends on the tradition that you're coming from, and part of it depends on what the person has done. Uh, for example, if your pastor or priest has done a lot of work in helping you plan for what you're doing and has spent a lot of time with you, then the honorarium should be a little greater. And it also depends on what your means are. You know, I made it a practice when I would do services for people. I would um, when they would ask me what my honorarium was, I'd say I don't. This is my service. This is part of my service being a chaplain. And there were some who made contributions to the hospital. There were some um, who did various things to honor the occasion. The other thing to know about or to be aware of is different religious customs. Most of what I've been talking about comes from the Judeo Christian tradition, but even within the Orthodox Jewish traditions and in the Islamic tradition, the emphasis is on simplicity. So you are either in the Orthodox Jewish tradition, the tradition is to use a plain pine box. In the Islamic tradition, either a shroud or a plain pine box. And in both traditions, the preference is for a quick burial. So the person should be buried within 24 hours. Now, this is sometimes a challenge. For example, when I was a chaplain, I had a lady who had lost her baby. Her baby had come to term, but was born stillborn. And she and her husband were Islamic. And he, on the one hand, he was trying to get the baby buried quickly. That had two implications. One was for his wife, who was in no shape to leave the hospital to attend her own child's burial. The other was on from the side of the hospital, where they were doing certain medical procedures to try to determine what had happened and what was the likelihood that it would happen again. Plus, there's certain state reports. Remember, I said earlier, if it's an unexplained, unexpected death, then the state has certain requirements for what you do. And they ended up in the nick of time being able to accommodate the family's request that the baby be buried within 24 hours. But it was a challenge and it was an adventure. So, what I want to kind of finish up today is how each person is unique. And I've said this over and over again today. What is important to you is what is important to you. And that is all well and good. But communicating those wishes to people around you is really helpful. Um, so I would strongly encourage you to start thinking, if you haven't already, start thinking about some of these things and how you want it to play out. Here are some resources. I have given you here two cremation services that are direct services that their service charges, which I mentioned, were less than $1,000, including picking up the body, cremating the body, and providing you the cremains in a box. The Veterans Administration burial benefits, there is some stuff online about what you can expect and how to access those benefits. And I've also given you the two links for the willed body programs.